Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our webinar, Federal Funding Outlook and Strategy on Child and Youth Homelessness. A little bit of general housekeeping to get going. This is a 1-hour webinar. We have muted the audio, so please do ask your questions through the Q&A. We are recording the session, so an archive will be available to you, along with all of the resources, including additional resources that aren't part of this PowerPoint. So all of that will come through a follow-up email, if not by the end of this week, by early next week. This is a webinar put on by Schoolhouse Connection. My name is Barbara Duffield. I'm the Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. We are a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education with lots of resources on our website. And I will turn it over to Darla to introduce herself.
Hi, and my name is Darla Bardine. I'm the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. We're happy to be here co-presenting this webinar, and we are dedicated to preventing and eradicating youth and young adult homelessness in America. And we are excited to have a guest speaker with us today. Anna used to work for Senator Murkowski on Capitol Hill and has been a champion on child, youth, and family homelessness issues. And she will be joining us today. She is now working for Covenant House International, and she's going to share her expertise as a Hill staffer and now with Covenant House International with you all today. Thanks, Anna, for being here.
Okay, so just a brief look at our agenda, what we plan to cover today. We're going to give just a very general outlook on the federal budget appropriations for FY24 and the implications for the programs that we all care about, the children, youth, and families that we all care about. We'll also provide some very specific tips and strategies for advocating for child and youth homelessness programs in this context. And then we have some step-by-step instructions about how to advocate for specific community projects within the federal budget. And last but not least, we're excited to share a new advocacy tool, which has child and youth homelessness data profiles that we just released last week in partnership with the University of Michigan Poverty Solutions. So without further ado, I want to talk about the current federal budget outlook. And I want to say, in prefacing what we're going to share, is that there are many programs within the federal budget that impact the lives of children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness and who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. Childcare, early childhood, higher education, housing, healthcare, nutrition. We're focusing today on the two targeted programs, the only two targeted programs in the federal budget that are specifically serving children and youth experiencing homelessness. So while we focus on those two programs, please know that the advocacy strategies and the general context applies to any other federal program that you may be advocating for and that you may care about. So what we know so far, everyone knows there's a divided Congress, and that makes the federal budget negotiations even that much more challenging. We also know that the House majority, House Republicans who now have control over the House, are very focused on cutting federal spending, going back to FY22 levels, and just overall have a focus on cutting federal spending. But at the same time, we also know that the House majority voted to keep community-directed spending, otherwise known as earmarks. So that's why we're including the earmarks and the community-directed spending as part of this conversation today. And all of this means that despite the challenges, despite the divisions, it's actually more important now than ever to educate your members of Congress about the needs that you're seeing in your community and how the programs that you're working with serve them or could better serve them with additional resources. This is a long process. This will take all year long to get through. We may end up with a continuing resolution. We don't know what's going to happen at the end, but there are some key deadlines that are quickly approaching. So there's some urgency and importance to taking action now. What we don't know is how all of the conversations and the drama about the debt ceiling are going to affect the fiscal year 24 budget process. We think there will need to be some answers by July. So we expect that we'll have a better sense of what that looks like by the summertime, but that's one very large unknown. We also don't know all of the specific deadlines. Individual House members, for example, have their own deadlines. Senate committees may have, and members may have different deadlines. So there's lots of deadlines that we don't know the specifics of, but we do know that they're approaching quickly next month, March, and even April. So stay tuned for some of the things of these pieces, which are also going to affect the timeline and our advocacy strategy moving forward. So now, getting into some of the specifics about advocating for homelessness programs and what are called programmatic requests. And I'm going to turn it over to Darla to just give a brief background about the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, which is one of the 2 federal programs specifically targeted to serving children and youth experiencing homelessness.
Thanks, Barbara. Hello again. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, it is a federal program administered at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It does provide direct grants directly from the federal government to community-based organizations. The grants can fund short-term emergency shelter for minors, longer-term transitional housing for 16 to 22-year-olds, and there's supportive services attached to each of those different housing models. And there is an emphasis on family reunification when safe and appropriate. It also funds street outreach and drop-in centers, host homes, scattered site apartments. It also funds a 24/7 communication center known as National Runaway Safe Line. Unfortunately, this program has been chronically overfunded. So of applicants who are applying for this funding, only 25% receive actual resources. This is due to a lack of enough funding being appropriated. Our request for FY24 is that Congress appropriate at least $300 million to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program. We do have a fact sheet that you can see that talks about the need for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program to see an increase in appropriations for fiscal year 2024, as well as the need for Congress to take action to reauthorize this program and make some key updates. Back to you, Barbara.
Thanks. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, which is the second account that we're focusing on today, this is the part of the McKinney-Vento Act that provides a broad set of protections and services for children and youth who are experiencing homelessness in our public schools. So this is the legislation that creates a mandate to review and revise any barriers to enrollment, attendance, and success. The funds are used for outreach, identification, staffing for homeless liaisons, which are required to be designated, immediate enrollment, school stability, transportation, and wraparound services. What we know right now is that currently less than 1 in 5 school districts nationally received Education for Homeless Children and Youth funding in 2021. And yet we know that over half of all children and youth who in the country are attending schools without these subgrants. The subgrants are critical because they create the capacity to identify children and youth who are homeless and make sure they have access to every other federal education program and local education program. So there's a direct correlation between having funding in a school district and being able to identify and appropriately serve children and youth who are experiencing homelessness. We also have a couple of fact sheets for you here. One is a current program fact sheet that goes over the trends, some of the impacts of homelessness on attendance and graduation, for example. And we also have a brand new data brief with the University of Michigan Poverty Solution that looks specifically at the correlation between having some Education for Homeless Children and Youth funding and being able to identify children and youth who are experiencing homelessness. We also want to talk for a minute here about the American Rescue Plan, Homeless Children and Youth Act funding, the ARP-HCY funding. This money also is still out there. This was part of the last COVID relief package. It's one-time funds, $800 million to support identification, enrollment, and wraparound services for children and youth experiencing homelessness. So it's 8 times the annual appropriation, but it's still less than 2% of all of K-12 federal education spending for a population that is over 2% of all students in the country. And what we know about the early impact of these funds is that instead of the funds reaching 1 in 5 school districts, they're now reaching over half of all school districts. 53% based on our preliminary information of school districts are now getting some level of dedicated support for children and youth who are experiencing homelessness, able to work with community partners in new ways, able to do staffing in new ways, more flexibility to meet those unique urgent needs of children and youth and who are experiencing homelessness in new ways. So we're really striving to maintain this level of support in future budgets. And there's a link here to a report that we did early in the fall that looks at some of the early progress and some of the things that are happening across the country. Our goals for these 2 programs for FY24 and beyond are on the next slide here, but also a little bit of the funding history. So you can see what these programs, what level they were funded at in fiscal year 22. You can see the level that they were funded at for this most recent fiscal year, the budget that was just completed, and see that both programs received some increases. I also want to share this slide to note that, again, the House majority is focused on rolling back at least to fiscal year 22 levels. So you can see the losses that would incur for these two programs, and those losses that would also be significant for other federal programs. For example, childcare in the last budget got a 30% increase, which is desperately needed for working families. That would be at risk as well if the funding went back to FY22 levels. And again, just to reiterate our asks as advocacy organizations for these programs, we want to maintain the ARP-HCY level for the education of homeless children and youth at $800 million. And for the RHYA program, $300 million, which is the level that's specified in the RHYA reauthorization. So what are some upcoming opportunities we mentioned to get involved and shape these conversations? Well, first and right around the corner in the House of Representatives are public witness testimonies. Now, the March 3rd deadline is if you want to come to DC be selected to provide very short, less than 5-minute testimony before the committee. That is open to anybody. There's a link that this link will take you to the website. But also, if you are not selected for the written for the oral testimony, or you're just too far, you want to come to DC, you have a lot to do between now and March 3rd. You can also submit written testimony, and anyone can do this. They give the instructions. It's 4 pages. It's a very good idea to let the full committee know the impact of these federal funds on programs. So that's one very close upcoming deadline and way to shape these conversations. Another is to ask for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, to be included in members' priority letters. So these are the letters that each member of Congress sends to the Appropriations Committee that says, here are my priorities. Every office is different in how they function, how they submit these requests. So the important thing here would be to contact your House member and your Senate and just ask. If it's not on their website, ask about how they're getting that information and urge them to make it a priority. And that is very soon. In fact, we had an email today from a U.S. House of Representatives saying as soon as possible to get those letters in. So there's urgency there. And the last thing in terms of this set of upcoming opportunities is if you've been around the National Network for Youth and Schoolhouse Connection for a while, you know that typically about this time of the year, we'll send an action alert out that says a dear colleague is being circulated to increase funding for EHCY and RHYA programs. And that's when some members of Congress are champions. They write the letter, the members of Congress write the letter to the Appropriations Committee, and they ask for their colleagues to sign on to show support. We typically have very little time to turn those around. One year, I think it was like 72 hours. But the more members who sign on to the letter, the more support it shows for these programs. So it's not clear at this point if we'll have a dear colleague letter that to be circulated. But if we do, we would ask that you respond to that alert as quickly as possible. I want to pause here and just see if Anna and Darla have anything else they want to add by way of context to these points. Nope. All right, I got it. All right, other strategies coming up. So I think it's important to remember that we have a new Congress, many new members of Congress, and always new staff. So there's high turnover on the Hill under the best of circumstances. And when you have you have an election, there's even more turnover. So you can't assume that members of Congress know about these programs and certainly don't know how they're impacting your community and the children and youth and families that you are working with. So it's important to have a very short fact sheets. We are in the post-literary or post-literate world where, bullets, 12-point font, 1-inch margins, very simple information that shows the local impact of these funds and the local need for these programs, and with the ask stated very clearly. So we'll have some examples to share with you, but that's an important piece of getting the word out. Also, virtual or in-person meetings with congressional members and their staff. This arguably is the most important thing you can do. And if it seems like it's a tall task, you haven't done it before, please know that our organizations are available to help. This is something that we do. We set meetings up all the time with constituents and their staff. We can provide as much or as little support as you need. So there's a link there if that's something that would be of interest to you. But the next couple of months are going to be very important for those direct conversations with staff. And again, if you've been told you work with a school district, you can't lobby, know that you can educate and we can make the ask. You can get other community partners to show support when they see there's a lot of people in the community that are supporting the need. That's a very, very critical thing to do. And then lastly, media stories make a huge, huge difference. There's never been a time when there's been a local article about McKinney-Vento, for example, or RHYA, and we've sent it to a congressional office with the request to meet that we didn't get that meeting. Members are paying attention and staff are too, but there's a lot in the news and the news cycle. So it really helps if you get a story like that. And I provided an example of a story about McKinney-Vento liaisons and homeless children and youth in Connecticut that is just the perfect kind of story. But even if it's a story that's focusing just on one district as opposed to many districts or one program, these are really important. So invite your local reporters to come cover what you're doing, and then that can be something that helps gets attention too. So I want to pause here too again and see Anna and Darla if there's anything else you want to add to these strategies. Another thumbs up. All right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit more about community projects and the context for those this year.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. As Darla mentioned, my name is Anna Dietrich, and I'm the new Associate Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at Covenant House International, and I'm here as a guest speaker. And I'm really speaking to my experience when I was on the other side of the table. I worked for Senator Lisa Murkowski for nearly 7 years in her office in Washington, D.C., and I handled appropriations for several fiscal years. And I actually was very involved in the community projects earmark process for many of our NGOs and organizations in Alaska. So I wanted to kind of provide some of my insights to you today and talk about the importance and kind of possibilities and opportunities around community projects. So what are earmarks? They're also known as community projects in the House. and the Senate. We refer to them as Congressionally Directed Spending, or CDS requests. And we have brought them back in Congress over the last 2 fiscal years. So this would be the 3rd year that organizations are allowed to apply for these funds. And this is funding that Congress gives directly to community-based organizations like many of yourselves, schools, etc., for specific initiatives. And so it's really bypassing the competitive grant application process, although there's a whole other process in terms of applying for these funds. It has typically in the previous 2 years been 1% of the total federal budget. And I'm going to give you some examples of some previous successful community projects to try to get a sense of what they are. Here are some examples of fiscal year 2022 successful earmarks from youth service providers. So we can see a range of different projects here, and it's really key to look at the range of funding opportunities with community projects. So I would say that you have possibilities of receiving between $200,000 to $2 million to even more significant sums of funding, but that the average award is probably around $500,000. And you can kind of see the variety of projects here. There's everything from, evidence-based violence reduction initiatives to workforce development programs. There's additionally an account for construction for facilities and equipment. So an expansion of actual, sites and programming for specific organizations. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of some successful projects from the previous fiscal year, and we were able to include some projects that were relevant to school districts as well here. So you can see there's projects that were awarded funding for housing services and supplies, including the purchase of food to improve economic outcomes for young adults transitioning out of foster care experiencing homelessness. There are a couple of projects that awarded funds to school districts or educational institutions for re-engagement and chronic absenteeism. And there's different accounts available for educational programming and opportunities for mentoring programs. And so there's a wide variety of uses for community projects. And I'll talk a little bit later about how you can look up the available eligibility to understand what is eligible to receive community project funding. Next slide, please. So what is the process to really receive an earmark or community project? There is kind of a clear process of how you would go about receiving the funds. So you if you're a member of an NGO, specifically a nonprofit organization, you are going to be eligible for some accounts to apply for community projects. The eligibility also includes school districts, state governments. It differs by accounts, which I'll get into a little bit later. The only real eligibility issue is around for-profit entities. So, lobbyists or for-profit entities cannot apply directly for community projects. Now, lobbyists are allowed to assist in terms of looking for community project funding, but it's not necessary. And the majority of community project funding requests that I saw when I was in Congress and I kind of worked through did not have any lobbyists. They came directly from school districts or community-based organizations specifically. And so you will go to your member of Congress and you will apply for the community project funding. And the application initially is usually not that taxing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then that member of Congress will prioritize the requests. In the House in previous years, there's been kind of a limitation on how many projects they're allowed to submit. In the Senate, there's less limitations. It really differs by each office, but members will prioritize requests. So that's kind of the first cutoff, and they will select certain requests to submit to the House or Senate Appropriations Committee. And when they do that, they are legally required to publish those requests on the website. So you will be able to see if you make the first cut, per se, of requests that go directly to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. And then after that, the House and Senate Appropriations Committee will start their internal vetting process. And that can take a significant amount of time. I'll kind of get into that later as well. But the interesting thing about community projects is that it's a shorter application up front, and your member will then kind of work through that application with you. But unlike the competitive grant process, which a lot of you are familiar with, you won't fill out the agency's kind of grant paperwork until the very end of the process, which can take upwards of a year or more later when you actually receive the funds. So at the end of the process, if you receive the funds, they will be earmarked to your organization. And then you will work with that federal agency and work on that federal grant paperwork to really receive those funds. So it's a little bit of a reversal compared to the competitive grant process where you're applying for grants that agencies put out. So that's really interesting. Next slide, please. And what I do want to talk about a little bit before I talk about what goes into a request for community project funding is kind of what Barbara was discussing in terms of this new Congress. And we do have a divided Congress. So even though we've had community projects and earmarks for the last 2 years, there will be some challenges this year. But the good thing is that as of now, both the House and the Senate seem to be accepting community project applications. Now, there are some changes that may impact the process. We have new chairs for the Appropriations Committee that I was mentioning before. And then the House Republicans have not really issued their guidance or kind of rules around applying for community projects, but the Senate has. The Senate's guidance is very similar to the previous 2 years. And so, when deciding if you want to apply to your senator versus your representative Congress, it may be a better idea to focus on the senator and to really prioritize getting requests into the Senate. And we do know that the application deadlines for the Senate have been posted by a good amount of senators. So it's important to go to the website of your member to look up what that community project application deadline is. Each senator is going to have a different deadline and a different kind of application process that is posted onto their website. So I kind of have gone through a couple of these items already. As mentioned before, the House is going to have different guidance, and we aren't quite aware of what that guidance is yet in terms of the fiscal year 24. But the Senate is going to be similarly structured to the previous 2 years. There's going to be less limitations in the Senate in terms of how many requests they can move forward. So that's another benefit of applying to the Senate. What's really interesting about community projects is they're not meant for multi-year funding. So you're going to hear this from staff a lot, that your community project funds are meant for 1 fiscal year of funds versus in a competitive grant application process, that grant you might be awarded that grant over 3 years or 5 years. So this is supposed to be for 1 fiscal year. What differs there slightly is that if you're eventually awarded that grant, that agency may give you a little bit of more flexibility in terms of spending that funds, but that differs by agency. And so it's important to think about this though, as kind of funding spent for one fiscal year. And in terms of explanation of request, it is going to be really important when you're applying for these funds that you explain why this is a really good use of taxpayer dollars. And I'll get into that a little bit later when I talk about tips and tricks in terms of applying for community projects. So project descriptions, it typically is a very short description, as short as 1,000 characters or sometimes 250 words of what that project is going to do. The application is going to actually be pretty short comparatively to some other applications that your organization might have partaken in, the initial application that you apply for on the senator's website. Having a budget breakdown is essential. This is something that the Senate offices and the House offices are really going to be looking at. It doesn't have to be exact, it can change over time, and it doesn't have to be very detailed, but having, a budget breakdown explanation to show that you've really thought through how you're going to spend those funds is going to be really important when applying for a community project. And demonstrating community support, that is going to be essential. It's going to vary by offices, but I will say when I was in a Senate office, if you can show that there is community support from, your local political leaders or other community organizations through letters of support or resolutions of support, members are going to want to support projects that are non-controversial. And so it's going to be helpful to show, everyone is behind this, everyone has been supporting this initiative. So that is really, really helpful as well. You can also partner with organizations and apply for these funds. You might be the main recipient of those funds, but you can work with other organizations and kind of apply with another organization. Next slide, please. So what can they fund? What can community projects fund? So it is limited, and this is where it does get important to refer to the guidance that I discussed earlier, put out by the Senate and the House. And like I said, we are waiting for the House guidance. So we're really working off the Senate's guidance right now. And usually there's a lot of similarities between the House and the Senate that might differ this year, but we're going to assume that it's going to be similar to the previous years in terms of applying. So the FY24 guidance has been published, and each agency has accounts to which you can apply. And each account has different eligibility requirements and different usage of funds. And we are going to make sure to attach the link for the FY24 Senate guidance. And when you go into this guidance, you can really see which account you might want to apply through funds. And if you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to give you some examples of some accounts so you can get a sense of what community project accounts really look like. And I want you to kind of begin to conceptualize how each account has different eligibility requirements and different things to think through before you're applying. So one of the most flexible accounts is actually the HUD account, EDIs for Economic Development Initiative. And it's really a flexible account which aims to serve low-income individuals. And it's for the construction of facilities for initiatives that support low-income individuals, right? And that's a very broad description of this account. And the eligibility within that is broad. And so this is the account that a lot of shelters, a lot of NGOs, a lot of community organizations, school districts, local governments apply for funds here for construction costs. So this is really where you can get funds to expand a building, create transitional housing facility. We had a good amount of youth programs actually receive funds to expand their shelter services or their transitional housing services. Boys and Girls Club, you can receive funds for your facility, which hosts programs, day programs, anything like that. So there are flexibilities in this account. The Educational Innovation and Improvement account, that is through the Department of Education. And this is where there is a lot of flexibility in terms of community project may be used for instructional services, after school centers, curricula development, teacher training, acquisition of books and computers, arts educations, school and emotional learning activities, full service community school, and early childhood education. So there's a lot of flexibility from K to 12, also higher education. And it's not just, the eligibility is not just around school districts, although they are eligible, but also community-based organizations. So last year, we saw the Boys and Girls Club of Los Angeles receive funding in its account for developing a digital program for student support. We also found another Boys and Girls Club receive funding for interventions to address adverse childhood experiences. We have seen many organizations receive funds to develop tutoring or mentoring programs. And the other slide, we saw that there's fundings in this account received for addressing chronic absenteeism. So there's a lot of opportunity as well in this account that you might find useful. I'm going to breeze through some of these other accounts to really consider. So the Administration for Children and Families account has, there's kind of two accounts here. There's the child abuse prevention, which is at the very bottom, and there's also the social service and research demonstration account. And this is run through the Administration for Children and Families. And these accounts can have kind of a broad uses in terms of eligibility. And you can use it for, in terms of the social service and research demonstration, it's all about making sure that youth, children, and families find a path to financial self-sufficiency. But that's kind of a broad, once again, eligibility. And so you can use this for case management services. Really on the programmatic side, there is services to support pregnant and postpartum women, services for youth experiencing homelessness more broadly, for them to, do workforce development, or for them to just achieve stable housing. So comprehensive kind of supportive services. So that might be an account to explore in terms of the programmatic side. And in terms of the child abuse prevention, there's a lot of projects in this account awarded for parent teaching or parent training and parent classes around parenting and child abuse prevention, ACE, adverse childhood experiences prevention. So there may be some eligibility there to think through. For the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, this one is pretty straightforward. It's also for programmatic support. One element here is that the Appropriations Committee last year on the Senate side did not allow funds to be used for residential services, residential mental health services or residential substance use services, but they did for daytime services or daytime support. So if you want to hire a mental health provider to come into your program and to provide additional mental health services, that would be eligible in this account. If you want to do recovery services or develop a peer-to-peer youth supportive program for either recovery of substance use issues or for suicide prevention services, that is all eligible in this account. And then the DOL Employment and Training Administration, this is going to be workforce development programming. So any kind of workforce training is eligible in this account. Burn Justice Assistance Grants, this is victim services. So really any services that are helping the criminal justice system, this is through the Department of Justice. So I know that some of the youth programming and you might do human trafficking prevention or work with the criminal justice system. Also child advocacy centers, if you're partnering with them at all, there might be some opportunities in this account. And then the aging and disability services. This is an interesting account that is eligible for programming around assisting individuals with developmental disabilities. And so if you want to do something around autism or disability supportive services or something like that to really support your youth or your children that you're serving, your clients, that might be something to consider. So I'm just kind of went through some of the accounts for you to really start thinking through eligibility, what is eligible to apply to. Next slide, please. So tips for preparing strong projects. So the first thing I want to get into is my experience sitting on the other side of the table as a staffer is you're going to go through this guidance document, which we've attached, and we'll make sure to provide as a resource to think through the accounts of where you might want to apply for a community project. And you're going to have a lot of questions around, when you're thinking about your project proposal, is this really eligible with the requirements set in this guidance? I wouldn't focus on that too much, because I think the more important thing is to really get that project proposal in, and then to really develop relationships with congressional staff and to really talk through kind of what your organization's needs are, and developing those relationships will really help that process. Many times your staffer can work with you even after you've submitted your project proposal to make sure that what you want to do is eligible for that specific account. So I wouldn't worry too much about meeting the eligibility requirements. Obviously, you want to the best of your abilities, but it's really important to establish that relationship with members of Congress after you've submitted the community project to them, to really think through further steps and to really be successful. And like I said, local support and well-documented potential benefits that are going to be really important, showing that your project is ready to start. So when I was talking to different organizations, when I was congressional staffer, I always told them, members are less inclined. You're actually not supposed to be applying for funds for just paying for programming that's already happening. So this is not supposed to be just funding to make sure that you can keep your doors open. It's supposed to be funding around new initiatives or to develop a new part of a current program. And so if you can show that you have a current program, but you want to expand it, or really do something different, or reach more individuals or children or youth, that's where you can show it's really ready to start. You've been doing the work, and members really appreciate that when you're applying for community projects. And as the slide says, the perfect project is an illusion. So don't get too stuck on thinking through a lot of these different eligibility issues. Once you talk to your member of Congress and develop that relationship, it will really kind of come into place. Next slide. So tips for preparing strong projects. So practicalities to consider when you're thinking through applying for community projects. So the project's timeline is really essential here. And I think showing that you are shovel ready, especially if you're about to apply for construction funds, is really important here. I will say that many members of Congress appreciate funding a project that has already started. So if you're looking for funds to complete a construction project, or to complete a different phase in a construction project of your facility, that is going to be something that congressional members are going to be very interested in. Sustainability, and really showing that since this is supposed to be only one-time funding, sustainability is key as well, to show that you're able to provide other funding after this funding is out, to continue your initiative or to finish your initiative, because that's going to be important as well. And so really thinking through what further steps are needed, what are the documented public safety, health, or educational benefits of the project? So any data that you have to really demonstrate outcomes of this program or this project is very helpful. And are there any trade-offs in investing in this project versus others in the region? And when you're applying to senators, this is obviously going to vary a little bit differently, because they're going to be interested in the whole state. But making an argument for the investment in that region can be very helpful. Economics to consider. Think through what type of jobs this might create. I don't think this is something that we heard a lot from different folks when they were applying, but this is helpful if you were able to demonstrate, especially with Republican members, how many jobs the community project creates. I think it's always helpful to mention. And then what is the regional economic benefit? What is the estimated impact on the local tax base? Those are pretty detailed questions. Once again, it's not something to get too stuck on, but always helpful to think about. And then I think this is one of the most important things actually is this project located in a disadvantaged or underserved area? Or will it support an underserved population? I think because of kind of the historical process of earmarks previously, there is a real interest in members of Congress to support community projects that serve underserved and disadvantaged populations. So really emphasizing that is always helpful. Next slide. So thinking through politics to consider. So I kind of got into it a little bit earlier about how the Congress is different this year. It's divided. We have a lot more guidance from the Senate side. It might be more helpful to go through the senators, versus the House members. But I did not mention that you really have to check each member of Congress, because many members of Congress do choose not to partake in the community project process. And this is true for many Republican members. They have just chosen not to submit community projects or support earmarks. So it's really key to really look on your Member of Congress website. I would say that the majority of Democratic members are participating in the community project, but there are less Republicans participating in this process. And so it's really important to think through who your members of Congress are. Now, if you have a Republican senator who's not participating, then maybe go to Plan B and think through applying through that House member. I think that if you have time, it's always helpful to submit the same application to both your House member and the senator. But if you only are able to submit to one, I think focusing on the senator due to the politics is really helpful. There's some other questions to think through here on this slide that are helpful, but I'm going to kind of move on and talk about developing a champion. I got into this before about developing that relationship with that member of Congress's staff. So it's going to be key that after you apply for your community project, that you request a meeting to discuss your project, invite your member of Congress out to your site locally and really talk to them there about the community project. Any ability to interact with the member of Congress or their staff about the project over the next couple months to a year is going to be crucial in the process. Next slide, please. So next steps, I've already kind of talked about this. Go right now, look at your members and your representatives' websites. That's really important. The senators' applications are around the corner. Many of them are early March. So literally look today if your senators are taking project applications for community projects for FY24. Remember, senators call them CDS. So look for a CDS application for FY24. Determine if your project is eligible. Use that guidance that we've attached here, and we'll make sure to share. Reach out to your representative and senators now, and make sure to advocate so that your request is prioritized. And that's why it's important to develop those relationships and meet with your member of Congress after your project is submitted. Next slide, please. So looking forward, so you have to, in terms of the broader timeline for community projects and congressionally directed spending, you have to prepare for the long haul. So you're going to kind of go through this process, and obviously the next couple of weeks are crucial for getting your application in. But once you do that, advocating over the next couple months after that with your member of Congress is going to be key. But it's a long process. This process can take upwards to a year, 8 months to a year, I always tell folks, or even longer for Congress to reach an agreement on their federal budget and for you to find out if you've received that community project. So this is a long process. You have to kind of be prepared. I tell folks, in terms of applying for community projects, you will likely not receive the funding from the community project that you apply for around a year and a half from when you apply it, because once Congress approves that community project, it will take the agencies another 2 to 5 months to get the funds out the door. So it is a long process, but it can be really worth it. We've seen a lot of really successful community projects, and it's a great way for your organization to develop a new initiative and really be successful. So I think I've touched on a lot of things, and I know I just want to be mindful of the time. I'm happy to answer any questions. Barbara and Darla, is there anything that I left out? Feel free to jump in.
I think the only point 2 points that I would like to make is one, for those of you who are either school districts who got ARP-HCY dollars, or you're a community partner who benefited from that arrangement with your school districts, this sort of targeted funding, community project funding, could be a great way to help sustain it. So we're really looking at sustainability strategies. So just to think about that, again, maybe you have an MOU with a housing agency or an MOU with an early childhood agency, and they could take on the work that you've started together. So this might be one idea for doing that. The other thing I'd say too is that even if your project isn't successful, it's a great way to develop the relationship with the congressional office and to help educate them about the needs. And so it could benefit and have an impact on the programmatic requests. We started off talking about the need to just globally raise funding or increase funding for RHYA and EHCY, which of course we have to do. When they see the needs like this come in through this other way, it helps elevate those other programmatic requests as well. So those are the only 2 points that I wanted to add on. Darla, do you have pieces of wisdom to share?
Well, I don't know about pieces of wisdom, but I will say that if you are a National Network for Youth member, we are here to support you in that process. So you can reach out to me directly after this webinar. We provide coaching and support to answer questions. But I just do want to underline the value of reaching out to your elected officials. Don't hesitate. Be very clear that you are looking to submit a congressionally directed spending request, and build that relationship, and just really emphasize that you want your members of Congress support to get it across the finish line, and be persistent. Definitely don't wait to talk to me before reaching out to your member of Congress. But if you are a National Network for Youth member, we are happy to provide support to you in this process.
You both. So the last piece we want to share before we open up to questions is just to remind everyone of the new tool that we unveiled last week. We're very, very excited about it. The potential for this to be a great assist to advocacy at the local, state, and federal level, as well as to improve practice, particularly with a look at children and youth experiencing homelessness. So these are searchable databases. You can go to the bit.ly there and see what it looks like. If you go to the state tab, you'll see a profile of many different metrics that are for the 2021 school year, including how much funding the state got under the regular EHCY, how much it's getting under ARP-HCY, and also information about unaccompanied youth who are experiencing homelessness. Lots of good information, and that will be great for your senators to share. And then, and this is the piece that is new and I don't think has ever been done before, is you can also search the data on child and youth homelessness by county and by congressional district. So we'll have a whole webinar on this tool on March 14th to show how to do that, but you can probably figure it out. It's pretty intuitive. So you can go to say, like, what does it look like exactly in a specific member's district, and then print that profile to share with them. So this is largely based on the pre-K-12 data on children and youth experiencing homelessness. We do have some Head Start data and some higher education data. Again, it includes unaccompanied youth status, race ethnicity desegregation, English learner status, disability status, and a lot more in terms of impacts. And again, these are handy profiles. Again, you hit print, it prints out an image, and that can be something you share. It is 2021 school year data, which means that it was heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, because we saw the decrease in enrollment specifically for children and youth experiencing homelessness. So you may have more recent data to be able to share a trend, to say this is what it was, this is what we're seeing right now. And of course, we'll update this in the fall, so we'll be able to have that trend data too. But this is a great new resource that we think will be really helpful for this sort of advocacy. And turn it back over to Dara.
Thank you, Barbara. For those of you who aren't already registered, our annual National Summit on Youth Homelessness is back in person this year. It's March 2nd and 3rd in Washington, D.C. Schoolhouse Connection is doing our education track as usual, so they'll be leading 3 breakout sessions during these 2 days. We also have a Hill Day and a federal agency roundtable discussion. If you can't make it in person, you can register to participate virtually, either as an individual, or you can buy a virtual office pass. And what folks do is they'll project the summit like in a large conference room or meeting room at their organization, and then the entire staff of your organization can attend the conference virtually. So we hope to see you there, and let me know if you have any questions. The hyperlink to register for either in person or virtual is included on the slide. It's also on our website under events. Thanks.
All right, so we've got some resources to share, but before we do that, we want to spend our remaining time on questions and answers. So I will ask Darla and Anna if they could see what's in the Q&A box that maybe hasn't already been answered, or that we want to answer verbally, or if you do have questions that you haven't asked yet, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A pane.
So Barbara, I think this question is for you. How does the district apply for EHCY funding?
So the State Department of Education is the entity in the state that puts out the McKinney-Vento subgrants proposals. It differs in every state. In some cases, it's a 3-year grant. In some cases, it's every single year. So what you want to do is go to the State Department of Education website, to their Homeless Children and Youth page, and that'll have that information. You can also go onto our website. We have a directory of state and local coordinators as well. And that would be how you would find out. It comes through from it's a competitive grant that goes out through the state education agency.
Thanks. And I think the next few questions are for you, Anna. So for the new earmarks or congressionally directed spending, is a 501c4 organization eligible?
Yes, from my understanding, they are eligible. The entities that are not eligible are for-profit entities. So you should be eligible to apply for funds, from my understanding.
And similarly, are there any restrictions with faith-based organizations like a mosque, a church, or a synagogue requesting fundings for, any of the allowable use of funds?
That's a good question. There is no restrictions for faith-based organizations. I think in many circumstances, faith-based organizations are encouraged to apply for community project funding. You just have to check on the eligibility requirements for the account that you want to apply for. So each account will have different eligibility requirements for the use of funds, for the resources that you can use them for. But I think that you definitely should apply for funds yes.
And so if someone is successful, hopefully many people on this webinar today will apply and be successful. That's our goal. What calendar year would they be able to start using those funds? There's a bit of I think concern among community-based organizations in terms of planning and budgeting of, when they would actually be spending that money, like how much time would they have?
Yes, and that has been an ongoing concern, I think, that we used to hear when I was a staffer all the time. And so I think I'm going to do my best to answer this question and not confuse you all more. But so first off, once you apply for the community project, the member of Congress will decide which projects to submit to the Senate Appropriations Committee. And once those are submitted, then it's the congressional process of waiting for that year-long budget to be approved. And so typically, in the previous years, we've seen a budget approved around Christmas time, so around December of 2023. Now, this year, we might have a continuing resolution. And if that is the case, we don't know the impact that will have on earmarks. But if it's been like the previous 2 years and Congress is able to come to an agreement, then we will hopefully have some sort of resolution around this December of 2023. But to my point earlier, even if you were to receive the funds from Congress in December of 2023, realistically, I would say anywhere between 3 to 6 months before you see the funds come to your bank account. So, around this time next year, or even further in the spring of 2024. Now, the federal agencies will give you a certain period to spend those funds. They will give you at least a calendar year from when you receive them, but many of the agencies will give you up to 2 years or even further from that to actually spend the funds. It differs by agency, but you will have at least a calendar year from when you receive the funds from that agency to spend the funds, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it is helpful. Thanks. Joe, you can let us know if it wasn't. Next question is for you, Barbara. Can ARP-HCY funds pay for cottages to be built on school district property?
No. The only use of ARP-HCY funds to support housing needs are for a few days in a motel as a temporary situation to help make sure children and youth can get to school and to bridge to other housing resources. So they can't be used for longer term housing. I can say that liaisons are being very creative with that use of motel, a couple of days in a motel to bridge to longer term housing solutions, working with their community agencies. One of the, I want to call it an irony, but if a family is staying in a motel, they're paying for it themselves. They're not considered homeless for HUD, homeless assistance. They're not eligible or prioritized. If a family is staying in a motel or youth is in a motel and a government or charity pays for that motel, they are HUD eligible. It's one of the problems with HUD's definition is you can have 2 motel rooms next to each other. One family is eligible, one isn't. So, the use of ARP-HCY just for a couple of days, a short bridge in a motel could actually unlock other housing resources because it makes that child, youth, or family HUD eligible. But again, just to answer the question, ARP-HCY cannot be used for the longer term housing uses.
But in terms of community project funding, the HUD Economic Development Initiative account can be used for that. So there is an opportunity for you to apply for a community project. You can either, the school district could apply for that account, or you could partner with a community organization and have them apply for that account to build those cottages on the school property.
That's awesome. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, next question, again for Barbara. Just to clarify, did you say that the data profiles that you just released are going to be updated in the fall? Okay.
Yeah, so we do not yet have from the department, all of the data comes straight from, it's all federal data with the exception of the Head Start data. And yeah, I saw it, it's all, officially ed data, but we won't have the 21-22 school year data until the summer, probably about July. And so that means by the time it takes us to put this together, it would be the fall, and then we would be able to show through these profiles the actual trends. So we would be able to show for each congressional district, county, LDA level what the trends are between those 2 years. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Great. And then I guess for either Anna or Barbara, can funding assist youth with funds to attend driver's ed?
So this is actually an eligibility that we tried to figure out last year. So this is actually a really good example of where this could possibly go into a variety of different accounts. And so my recommendation here would be to apply through the account that you think it fits mostly in. So I think here you might want to try to do that through the ACF social service and demonstration account. And kind of, you might say that this is going to help that youth achieve financial self-sufficiency. So it's essential in providing that programming. But when you meet with that member of Congress staff, and that's why this meeting is so essential after submission. So the members of Congress have deadlines internally and on their websites that are going to be a couple weeks before, up to a month before they are required to submit your project to the committee, if they so choose. And so in that timeline, they can actually switch things so that you can work with them and say, oh, if it's, and this is where you should ask the right questions. If they say, well, that isn't quite eligible, you can ask them, well, is there an account that you know of that you can switch my application to apply for those funds? So that's where, it never hurts to ask. I know it can be intimidating when talking to your members of Congress of staff, but they have a lot more flexibility than they let on. So you should ask the right questions here to make sure you can find an account that it fits in.
And in terms of using ARP-HCY to pay for driver's ed, I don't know if that has been asked before, but what I do know is that the department has been saying yes a lot more because these funds are much more flexible. So for example, ARP-HCY funds can be used for gas cards. They can be used for car repair. And some school districts have asked if they could pay auto insurance for youth because that was the barrier to having a car to be able to get to school. So it's case by case and it has to be related to the ability to get to school. But knowing that the department has said yes to things like auto insurance, car repairs, and gas cards, I think it's a very good question to pursue.
Great. I don't see any other questions.
All right, so we'll just share a few resources before we close out. The link here, the report that I mentioned that just was released last week that shows specifically how dedicated homeless education dollars support identification of students experiencing homelessness. That's the link there. I also took the report that we did on just the trends and needs and made it into just a plain Google Doc, the second bullet there that you can download and then edit and use in your own fact sheets. And I'll let Darla share a little bit about the last two resources there.
Yeah, and then the third is the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act fact sheet that you all can use in your advocacy meetings or just to educate. It talks about what the federal program funds at a community level and nationally, and just the updates that are needed to the program through reauthorization and why we need increased funding to reach more young people in more communities across the country. And then the fourth is just our broader FY24 youth homelessness appropriations fact sheet. It includes the two programs we talked about today, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Program, as well as some requests within the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Thank you. And again, just to reiterate that we are here to help with the setting up meetings with your members of Congress, whether it's virtually or not. It's something that we actually really love to do. So if you're interested in that, there's a link here for the network, and Darla and Anna and I partner all the time with these meetings. So we are your homeless children and youth federal team across these areas. Then a great big thank you, Anna, for joining us as a special guest. I might as well just tell the world that Anna was the driving force behind ARP-HCY when she was on the Senate. Her middle name is Don't Say No. Don't ever let them tell you no. So we're super happy that she's now up here with us at Covenant House International. And thank you also, Darla. Any last words that either of you would like to share?
I'll just say we'll be pushing out this recording and slides tomorrow with, I think, also maybe a little fact sheet and additional resources about the congressionally directed funding. So more to come. And thank you all for being here. It's been great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.